You're listening to Big World Network.
Heart of the Hurricane, Episode 1. Written by May Woodworth. Read by Ton Korkowski. Warning: although there is no material subject matter within that couldn't be found in any general bookstore with no age constraint, this series is rated 18 and contains adult situations and content. August 1926. Off the coast of Sable Island, Canadian Maritimes. Magnificent waves crashed mercilessly onto the fishing schooner as the captain held tight to the wheel, doing his best to keep their craft afloat. Each assault was stronger than the last, and it wasn't long before his efforts were proven futile. Yet held on he did. An almost inbred instinct to retain some control of the ship, regardless of how lofty the control, shined through his despair. First Mate John Neely remained transfixed on the chaotic horizon as the storm overpowered them. Its sudden eruption roused memories of the ancient mariners' tales which frightened him as a lad. The illustrations in the books depicted sea serpents raising their scaly heads out of the ocean depths, and monstrous leviathans equipped with gaping maws. He half expected a giant octopus to arise from the thrashing foam, wrap its evil arms around the ship, and drag it to the ocean floor. The crew had done their best to weather the gale. Each and every man fought, not only concerned with their own survival, but in doing whatever it took to keep their shipmates on board. Sable Island would have been on their radar if the ship had radar, but the outdated schooner had none. John felt they were not simply miles from land, but on another planet altogether. The battering continued until finally, with fanfare, the sea rose to embrace the men. She rose to such an extreme height that they had to crane their necks to face her. Winds howled until they reached such a piercing crescendo that John was momentarily deaf, left in the silence of his memories. As the huge wall of water towered over the ship, John took a deep breath. His last thought was of Eliza. How he would miss her warm body, her riot of dark hair, and her brooding brown eyes. But most of all he would miss her laugh. Hers was not a light, tinkling laugh, but a deep chuckle. Before he could think on her any further, the sea claimed the men. They returned to the bountiful source which had provided for them their entire lives. They returned to the source of their beginnings. Nova Scotia, 1927. Once Pastor Tully finished his sermon to bless the fleets, Eliza took a deep breath and rose to her feet. Her heart beat wildly. She made a conscious effort not to clutch John Jr. too tightly, instead cradling the baby in the crook of her left arm, swaying back and forth gently as she faced the congregation. "I beg of you," Eliza pleaded. "Stay in port. Wait for the new equipment." "Stay in port?" a man scoffed. "What kind of craziness is this?" "You must stay," she said vehemently as she stepped into the aisle. Tears filled her eyes as grief squeezed her heart. The memories of speaking those same words to her husband last summer were unbearable. Scoffs and grumbles vibrated throughout the church. The pastor tried to lead her back to her seat. "They have to listen," she snapped, shrugging his hand off of her arm. John stirred in her arms, so she took a deep breath and let it out slowly. He squirmed again, and then went lax. Eliza stood her ground, gazing around the small church, trying to make eye contact with as many of her fellow townspeople as possible. She faced mixed reviews. Some people met her eyes, only to drop them after a few scant moments. Some avoided her gaze altogether. How are we to feed our families, eh? You plan on handing us bags of money if we stay in port?" The issuer of the comment was Mr. Miller. His wife stared at Eliza curiously, arched eyebrows added for emphasis. The pastor placed a hand on Eliza's shoulder, speaking in his best pastoral tone. "The month of August will be difficult for all the families that lost loved ones last summer. Your neighbors are here for you. I'm here for you. God is here for you." Eliza shrugged his hand off as she took a few steps down the main aisle, her panic increasing. "The August gusts are not done haunting our seas. Have you not looked at the skies? Can you not feel death on the wind? The sea wants our men," Eliza cried. Again John stirred, this time fluttering his baby eyes open. Eliza resumed her rocking until his wee eyelids fluttered before closing again. His tiny baby lips issued a somnolent smile as he drifted back into baby dreamland. "Gah! You haven't a crystal ball," Mrs. Duffy scoffed. "Or do ye, I heard you begged your mister last summer not to leave port, and look what happened." The only midwife in town eyed her suspiciously. The unfriendly glare immediately raised the hairs on the back of Eliza's neck. Eliza darted her eyes to the woman sitting next to Mrs. Duffy, John's Aunt Abigail. Eliza had no doubt that the midwife had heard the story from Abigail by the way she fidgeted and cast her eyes downward. "Lize, I know you've had it worse than most, but you're not the only widow here. I lost my Samuel." Patrice spoke up. She jutted her chin toward the woman sitting in the pew in front of her. "Laurel here lost her James. Look around you. Everyone in this church was affected by the gales. Get a hold of yourself, woman. Us widows will be getting the government check to help us through this, but our neighbors have to eat. The ships have to go out." Patrice sat up straight, pulling her cloak around her tight, her lips pursed even tighter. A commotion erupted from the back of the church. An elderly man rose out of his seat as quickly as his old bones allowed, shaking his fists heavenward angrily. "At least it wasn't as bad as the gale of 1873. Did you know these islands lost close to 1,000 men that year? My papa and most of his uncles included. But we still fish. It's in our blood. You're a newcomer, Eliza Neely. I can't expect you to know what's in our blood." An equally old woman, his wife, tugged at his shirt-sleeve to get him to sit, shushing him all the while. He grumbled as he held the pew in front of him, lowering his old bones back down, a frown plastered on his wrinkled, weather-beaten face. Eliza's shoulders drooped, not only from the stern tone in his voice, but the grumbled assent of the other parishioners. He was right. She was a newcomer. If John hadn't traveled to Quebec 3 years prior and met her on the boardwalk, she wouldn't be standing there at all. "It's wrong," she mumbled weakly, the steam leaving her sails. "You know lives can be saved with radios and radar. At least wait until all the ships have them." She gazed around the church, turning left and right slowly. This time everyone met her eyes. What she saw was disheartening. Anger and embarrassment were gone. They now gazed at her with pity. It was the same way they looked at old Sam Woodman, who had lost touch with reality after his wife and children died in that horrible fire a few years back. Now he was useless to fish, or anything else, instead residing with a family member, his spirit in a faraway place. The pastor spoke loudly, walking to the head of the church. "I think we need to pray some more. Pray that our men and ships are followed by angels when they leave this port, and pray that the rest of us find peace," he called over his shoulder. After he got into position, his eyes fell upon Eliza as he began the Lord's Prayer, gesturing her back to the pews with his hand. Instead of acquiescing, Eliza turned her back on him, as well as the congregation. She left the church, John Jr. snug in her arms, in a steady, measured pace. Once she descended the church steps, she peeked in the blanket at her son. He was still fast asleep. You'll not be a fisherman. Ever," she whispered firmly. She kissed her son's forehead and embarked on the mile walk back to her cottage, deciding that if she couldn't save the townsfolk from more misery, she would somehow save her son. Ripping one's heart out and giving it to the sea would not be in her son's blood if she could help it. Nova Scotia, present day. "Hey, can we go up to the attic? There used to be neat stuff up there." Melissa absently picked at the large, tattered rip on the thigh of her jeans. Niki knew rips and holes were in style, but she couldn't quite wrap her brain around the appeal, not to mention the ridiculous price tags on said holy garments. Niki shrugged. "The cottage was insulated again a few years ago, and the roof was worked on. I don't know if the stuff is still up there." Melissa heaved her body off the couch in that exaggerated way she had. She was thin and fit, yet at times she moved like a person carrying a lot of bulk. "Let's go find out. Besides, where else would they put everything in a 2-bedroom cottage? This place is tiny," she called over her shoulder, heading for the rope in the hallway that retracted the attic stairs. She stood on her tiptoes, reached up, and grasped the knotted rope while Niki rose from the rocker. The unbearable screeching of the descending wooden steps caused Niki to cringe. Her teeth actually ached from the high-pitched cacophony. "That has to be fixed," she said with a grimace as she approached the steps. "Guess you're not deaf after all," Melissa said sassily, ascending quickly up the narrow steps. Niki frowned as she watched her daughter, remembering when she was that nimble. Instead of racing up quickly, Niki took her time, taking special care when climbing into the attic proper. "They didn't skimp on insulation," she said, nodding to the double layers of fluffy pink bursting from the rafters and walls. Melissa began pawing in boxes, which made Niki smile. Her daughter was just as nosy as she was. "Oh my God, this is so fucking funny," Melissa said with a laugh. She was holding a huge woman's hat. It was festooned with large silk flowers and ribbons. "It's like a circus float." Niki chuckled. That was probably quite stylish back in the day. Melissa sat cross-legged on the floor and kept rummaging through boxes, pulling out items she thought were particularly funny. She did a lot of dust-blowing. Meanwhile, Niki picked up a leather-bound book that was at the bottom of a box of papers. She opened the book carefully, taking her time as to not rip the pages. Her Nana's familiar tight handwriting forced her to read the first entry slowly. "My biggest fear and my biggest joy is that I would love him with such passion until my dying breath. It is both a blessing and a curse to love him so intensely. He is in my thoughts constantly, like a restless ghost. Instead of haunting our cottage, he haunts my mind. I have given up trying to comprehend such a thing. I have given up trying to change it. I now know I am doomed. Please, God, help me to care for our new baby. I know not if I have the strength." May 20th, 1927. "What's that?" Melissa asked when she glanced up. Niki held the diary up. "It looks like my grandmother's diary. Maybe she used it as some kind of grief therapy," she said absently. "Guess that didn't work," Melissa mumbled. "Liz!" she shot back, glaring for good measure. Melissa's eyes widened with surprise. "Hey, don't get pissed at me. I'm just telling the truth. It's not my fault your grandmother tried to kill herself." Niki closed the old diary carefully. "Who said she tried to kill herself? Oh, wait. Your father again?" "Come on, Mom. You really buy that Nana almost drowned by accident? She grew up along a river, and she was a strong swimmer. I remember when I was a kid she would do laps every morning in the cove." "Accidents happen, Liz. I think you need to stop listening to your father when it comes to my family." "Well, he only told me because he said it was for my own good. He said depression runs in families," Melissa said carefully. Niki frowned. "Okay, so I was depressed last winter. Sue me. I've never been divorced after a 20-year marriage before. And yes, I had postpartum depression when you were a baby. A lot of women do. It doesn't mean that depression runs in our family." Okay, Melissa soothed. "Sheesh. But you have to admit that a lot of weird things happened here. You can see why Dad says those things. Nana's accident. The dead body they found in the cove. And of course what happened to Uncle Stephen. Stuff like that doesn't happen nowadays. This place was like bad luck back then." "Nana Eliza and Great-Aunt Johanna went through a lot. Give them a break," Niki said softly. Redirecting her gaze to the cover of the diary, her fingertips traced the carvings of flowers in the thick leather, wondering if her grandmother had done the same thing when she held it, also wondering if the answers to the mysteries of the past were inside. She clasped the diary to her chest as she gazed out at the sea through the tiny attic window. "I wonder about all that, too," she said. "Especially her almost drowning. It seemed like she and Johanna were always together. Why not that night? And why would she go swimming at night alone anyway?" Melissa shrugged. "Yeah, they were totally best friends. I always wonder why neither of them got married. Nana was young when her husband died. She wasn't ugly or anything. Neither was Johanna. Johanna was actually really pretty even when she got old," she commented. Niki yawned and began to rise. Her lower back ached, and she arched in an attempt to get the knot out. It didn't work. "Hey, you want to take the bikes to that ice cream place?" Melissa glanced sideways. "You want ice cream again?" she asked as she rose. "Come on, it'll be fun," Niki responded quickly. "Let's drive. If you're too tired, I will." Melissa pursed her lips as she stared at her mother. The issue of Niki constantly avoiding being a passenger to her daughter hung above them. "I really need the exercise," Niki commented. "Seriously, I've been eating a lot. If I don't exercise, I'll get fat." Melissa frowned, for once not arguing. Niki wondered if Melissa was remembering the much fatter version of her from a few years ago. Melissa rolled her eyes. "Okay, but if I have to bike, I'm getting a banana split," she said. Niki grinned. "You always get a banana split, whether we drive or bike. Why do you always pick the most expensive thing on a menu?" Melissa headed toward the attic stairs. She positioned herself to descend them backwards. "Tough crap! If you're making me spend 2 weeks here, then I deserve it. You're depriving me of the luxuries of civilization," she said, poised on the top step, her upper body still in the attic. An image of Melissa falling down the steps flashed in Niki's mind. "Make sure you hold on. Don't screw around," she ordered. Melissa mocked falling backwards, and Niki's heart leaped. Just then Melissa's cell phone went off. Her face lit up as she began talking excitedly to her best friend, Ashley, telling her of all the cool old stuff they found in the attic, the awesome restaurants they'd been eating at, and the treasures she found along the beach, and of course Patrick. She continued talking as she finished her descent out of the attic and made her way down the short hallway. Her voice faded as she exited the house. Niki smiled softly to herself. "Deprived kid my ass," she mumbled. She herself descended, diary clasped tightly under an arm. When she pushed the folding stairs to retract them, the noise was again, to her, akin to nails on a chalkboard amplified 1,000,000 times. She added WD-40 to her mental shopping list, deciding that she would definitely be making more trips to the attic that summer. Nothing like a good mystery to capture her interest. In this case, there were several.
Music provided by Roger Palmer. TuneCore.com/music/Palmer Music.
You're listening to Big World Network.